Welcome to our lecture on St. Catherine of Siena. She is one of the most remarkable personalities of the Middle Ages. Her mystical experience was able to provide an impetus for the great power of the papacy to find something of its way again. She was born in 1347, the 24th of 25 children, in the Republic of Siena, the great rival of Florence. She would come to experience a profound mystical identification with Christ in terms of what was claimed to be an invisible stigmata, that is, to have the 5 wounds of Christ in her own body, though not apparent to anyone else. I know that sounds crazy, but the great stigmatic before, the one that emerged in history, would be St. Francis of Assisi. So this links her spiritually to one of the 2 great mendicant orders, the Franciscans. And she, in fact, joined the Dominicans as a tertiary, that is, not as a fully professed religious, but as a lay member of the order. So that links her with the great tradition of Aquinas, for instance. She was motivated by religious visions from her childhood and experienced a divine marriage with Christ. So she was very deeply caught up in the dynamism of another world. And yet she had a profound impact in this one. And that leads us to ask the question, can mystical experience be socially relevant? Can this thing, which is so private, to have this set of experiences that are not publicly available, can that lead to something that is fructifying in the world? In fact, we find with Catherine a personality that is not only able to converse at the highest levels with powers and principalities of this world, but she's doing so as a woman, which is remarkable. She's very much, her holiness gathered, as holiness tends to do, gathers followers, and people begin to recognize there's a source of power here that is not the power of this world. And then the powers of this world start to pay attention. That would seem to be something that comes and goes with different ages. But in the medieval period, it mattered if you had this kind of charism, the charisma of the mystic, of the conspicuously holy person. And so people from all walks of life would write her, seeking her counsel, and she would provide it. And she would, in fact, play a great role in this drama of the great power politics of the time involving the papacy. Background, of course, is that we've got the crisis of the 14th century, which was a time of profound upheaval. We have the High Middle Ages between 1000 and 1300, more or less. And so we're entering now into the late medieval period. And that is when we're transitioning from this time of antiquity being taken up into another civilization, Christian civilization, and we're going into the modern era through the Renaissance. The crisis already began before the Great Black Death, the Great Plague, which killed maybe 40% and some places more of the population, not only of Europe, but this was a worldwide plague. It seems to have begun in the Tibetan plateau and decimated, well, more than decimated, it destroyed populations in Asia, in Africa, and of course we have it most documented in Europe, and that arrived in 1348. But even before that, the immense population increase that had fueled the progress of the High Middle Ages, that had already reached the carrying capacity of the current technology of the time in Europe. And so there were already famines in the early years of the 1300s. Climatic change was also not favorable, cooling, which made, and more too much rain and moisture was causing difficulty already. That led to a general susceptibility to what would be a very devastating bacterium. We also have wars that are always part of the scene, but we have in the great conflict between England and France something that would define the tenor of the late Middle Ages. Of course, we'll talk about the 100 Years' War coming in future sessions, but those wars began before the 100 Years' War, and as the world is shifting from something like the imperial model, which was an echo of the Western Roman Empire in the Germanic kingdoms, and that great conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope was giving way to a new conflict between the Pope and a certain national monarch, that is King Philip IV of France. And so you have, in that battle between France and England, you have the formation of a more concrete national identity, the beginning, really, of the condition of modern nationalism. So we have those wars, we have a lot of uprisings. The Black Death ushered in not just despair, but also a sense that things could be different socially. And so we have in the last half of the 1300s an immense number of uprisings by commoners against the aristocracy, hundreds of uprisings, and including, we have earlier, around the time of the Black Death, we have uprisings including Cola di Rienzo's setting up of a republic, as it were, in Rome, right before the outbreak of the Black Death. We have the Jacquerie as a way of naming uprisings all around France after the outbreak of the Black Death and the continued deprivations of the 100 Years' War. We have the Ciompi Revolt in Florence, and on. Peasants' Revolt in England. We'll see some of these in a future lecture. Okay, so that was all part of the background too, in which Catherine came up. But the one that is most definitive for her life and was absolutely crucial for the mind of Europe, alongside the Black Death, would be what Petrarch called the Babylonian captivity of the church in Avignon. This was an ecclesiastical enclave in the south of France. We remember that France wasn't united as the country we know now until the Albigensian Crusade allowed the north of France to take over the south of France. This city of Avignon isn't directly under the control of the French king. It is on the Rhone River. It is a very important, very well situated strategically for contact with both the Mediterranean and with the north of France. And it is here that the papacy resided more or less from 1309 to 1377. That is, Rome was abandoned as the seat of the papacy, and this was a very devastating sense, devastating to the sense of what it meant to have a center of European unity. If one could compare it, I think, to the sack of Rome in 410. That is, political power had shifted from Rome by the time the sack had happened, but the sack of Rome still meant something profound to those who, to a world that was finding its bearings symbolically in this city, the eternal city. The popes hadn't spent a lot of time in Rome at the time of the Babylonian captivity, so-called. They had been forced out of Rome by the vicious baronial politics of the city of Rome, or by great power politics, but they would generally stay in Italy, at some other city, And they didn't move the whole papal machinery to whatever place they were staying. The papal archives, all of that was still in Rome, even if the popes weren't there. The shift to Avignon was different. It meant abandoning the place where the See of Peter, that is the seat of the Bishop of Rome, the seat of Christendom, on the relics of Peter and Paul. I mean, that's why for Christianity, Rome had primacy as the place where Peter had his seat of authority, but also, and before that in a way, because this is where Peter and Paul were both martyred. To move away from Rome in kind of a definitive sense meant to lose the symbolic center of unity. And that's what happened in 1309. This followed upon the struggle between King Philip IV of France and Boniface VIII, the great villain of Dante's life in a way, because Boniface is the one who engineered the coup that led to Dante's exile. But Dante did not think of King Philip IV as some good guy because he was opposed to Boniface. Boniface issued, in the great struggle between King Philip and Boniface, which were competing claims as to who had primacy over, say, the clergy of France, whether the king could tax the clergy of France, and this was when the clergy were much more aristocratically caught up, or whether the Bishop of Rome had primacy in terms of how the clergy were treated. Philip wanted to be able to get money as he chose, and Boniface reasserted that in fact the Pope has primacy with authority not only over the clergy, but in fact over temporal power too. And he reaffirmed this in a papal bull called Unam Sanctam in 1302, a position that Dante very much disagreed with, I think wisely. But before Boniface could excommunicate King Philip, which would have led to many difficulties, because this is the thing, that tool of excommunication is what helped fragment the Holy Roman Empire. King Philip had thugs kidnap the Pope in Anagni and had him beaten up. The people of the town rose up to defend the Pope, partly because the troops that were being used to kidnap the Pope started to pillage. And so the Pope was rescued, but he died a month later, so presumably from that trauma. What we have then is a situation in which the King of France has shown that he's willing, like an abuser, right? He's shown the willingness to use violent force, and that would cow every pope after for decades. There would be, within a couple of years, the election of a man named Bertrand de Gaulle to the papacy as Clement V. He was a smart man. He seemed to be kind of a conciliatory figure because he had ties to both the kings of England and France. And he stayed, and he was a Frenchman, broadly speaking. I mean, these were, south of France isn't exactly a Frenchman, but that he's from Bordeaux, I believe. And so Clement stays in the south of England, so eventually will move to Avignon. He starts there because he says he needs to mediate between the kings of England and France, because there was this long-standing war, this intermittent war that's breaking out. So that makes some kind of sense. He moves to Avignon eventually because that, again, allows for a strategic amount of communication. The popes will use this excuse from then on, partly because they are Frenchmen from then, and they stay within the French sphere of influence. One of the successors who lives in Avignon is John the 22nd, notorious as a man who was virulently opposed to the Fraticelli, that is the spiritual Franciscans, in saying that poverty is essential to Christian identity. And this is part of the reason that someone like Petrarch could say that the papacy under John the 22nd has become like Babylon. And you get that representation at the end of the Purgatorio by Dante, where you've got the church as the whore of Babylon being married to this goon, this ogre, who is King Philip the Fair. And that's the view, is that in fact this is a horrible alliance. There's another saint before St. Catherine comes along, St. Bridget of Sweden, who implores the popes to get back to Rome. She actually gets Urban V to go in 1367. He's there for 3 years and then leaves again, so that the papacy isn't reestablished in Rome permanently yet. At this point, St. Catherine takes over. She's imploring the popes, get back to Rome. Part of it is, everybody's looking at the Black Death, they're reading it in their own way. They're saying, what is it that they think is wrong with the world? Well, part of the response of many Christians is to say, the Pope should be in Rome. This is a profound disorder in the world. Get back to Rome. This will help set the world right. Gregory XI accedes finally to St. Catherine. There's every reason to believe that she was decisive in this decision. Gregory XI finally moves the papacy back to Rome in 1377. Now, after that, there's going to be this, in a way, even more devastating schism, the Great Papal Schism, which results because the French still want to retain control over the papacy. Urban VI is the one that's originally elected under threat of a Roman mob, it's true, and that's the excuse that the French cardinals are going to use to elect their own claimant to the papal throne. But Catherine will, in fact, support Urban VI and encourage Christendom to follow the Pope that was elected by the conclave of the whole of the cardinalate. She is sent by the Pope after after the reestablishment of the papacy in Rome to Florence to negotiate peace between the Pope and Florence. She's there when the Ciompi revolt takes place, and her life was in danger from those events. In 1377 to 1378, she receives the visions that constitute the matter of the Dialogue of Divine Providence, which is the work from which we get the selection we have in the Great Conversation. Here you have you have a soul who knows that the way of Christ is the way of suffering love. You have someone who's entered very deeply into the mystery of Christ's heart, and that is an agonized and crucified heart for the sake of the world. And I think it's so obvious that she burns with this charity that in a way that allows for a new kind of social vision, one that's informed by the thought that the kingdom of God is something that should embrace all. That I think of her as the doctor of solidarity. She and Teresa of Avila were declared the first two female doctors of the church. I think that's well deserved. She's one of my favorite saints. She's just a beautiful personality. And what she represents is that I think she's part of this great shift from a clerically based and a theologian based religiosity in Catholicism to something like the Devotio Moderna, which will be the Brotherhood of the Common Life. The Brethren of the Common Life will take that up, which is reflected in Thomas Aquinas' Imitation of Christ. She's another lay person, as it were, who's she's changing the world based on something that isn't mediated through hierarchical strictures. She is just raw with the love that burns for the world, burns with the love of Christ. And that shifts things. I mean, it doesn't change things permanently, but what it does is sets a new kind of order into society. And a time when there's all of this confusion, when people are wanting to seize hold of liberty, nothing ever is in history just settled perfectly and permanently. But what we do want to see is this upwelling of an access of love that is more than the emotions and the paradigms that we get from normal experience. That mystical access of a love that is overwhelming, limitless. That's what I think St. Catherine shows us, and it does create something new possibility, and it can still do that for us today.